His thighs were tense, his hands resting their fingers curled slightly, as if fighting to remain still and there. Beneath the fabric of his jeans, something undeniable strained. Against the tight space, I never thought much about elevators. They were just metal boxes designed to transport people up and down without much thought, but that day in the dim emergency light, pressed up against my stepson, I realized elevators could also be cages trapping people together in ways that could never be undone. It had started as an ordinary afternoon. The office was nearly empty, most of my colleagues having left early for the weekend. I had stayed behind, as I always did, drowning myself in work to avoid the silence of home. My husband Richard was away on business, and I had no desire to return to an empty house. I was reviewing documents when my phone vibrated. Ryan's surprise. I'm downstairs. I blinked at the message, my stomach tightening. Ryan, my husband's son from his previous marriage, had been away at college for months. He rarely texted me, let alone showed up unannounced. A wave of unease swept over me as I grabbed my things and headed for the elevator. When the doors slid open, there he was. Ryan had always been handsome, but something about him now felt different. His features were sharper, more defined, and he carried himself with an effortless confidence that hadn't been there before. His dark eyes met mine, and for a brief moment I forgot how to breathe. You weren't answering my calls, he said, stepping inside. As I followed, thought I'd come surprise you. The doors closed behind us, and before I could respond, the elevator gave a violent jolt. Then darkness, a mechanical groan echoed through the shaft as the elevator ground to a sudden halt. The emergency light flickered to life, casting long, eerie shadows across the confined space. I reached for the control panel, pressing buttons frantically. Nothing were stuck. I whispered, my voice barely above a breath. Ryan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. Looks like it. Silence settled between us, thick and suffocating. The air felt warmer, the space impossibly small. My heart pounded, not from fear, but from something far more dangerous. I tried pressing the buttons again, but nothing happened. The elevator remained still, trapping us inside its dim, humming silence. Ryan leaned against the wall, exhaling slowly. Guess we wait, he said, his voice calm, almost amused. I wasn't amused. My heartbeat was erratic, and the space suddenly felt smaller than it had a moment ago. The air was thick, warm, tinged with the faint scent of his cologne, woodsy, unfamiliar, but oddly comforting. You okay? He asked, his gaze steady on me. I nodded automatically, even though my pulse was racing. The truth was, I wasn't okay. Something about being here, alone with him, unsettled me in a way I couldn't quite explain. The emergency light flickered, casting moving shadows across his face. He had changed since the last time I saw him. His features sharper, his presence heavier. There was something unreadable in his expression, something that made my stomach tighten. I turned away, willing the walls to feel wider, the air to feel cooler, but there was no escaping the closeness, no escaping the way his eyes lingered on me. And then he spoke again, his voice softer this time. We haven't really talked in a while. I nailed, steadying myself. You've been busy with school. His lips quirked, something like a smirk, but not quite. And you've been busy avoiding me. The words hit harder than they should have. I opened my mouth to deny it, but the way he looked at me, like he already knew the truth, made it impossible to speak. The elevator remained still, the silence stretched, and somewhere in the quiet a line we never acknowledged began to blur. I exhaled slowly, keeping my expression neutral. I haven't been avoiding you. Ryan tilted his head slightly, his dark eyes. Unreadable no, then why do you always leave the room when I walk in? A lump formed in my throat. I wanted to say it wasn't true, but we both knew it was. I had noticed it happening, more and more subtle. Unspoken moments where I would excuse myself when he entered, where I kept my conversations with him brief. Where I avoided looking at him for too long. I turned away, pressing the emergency call button again, hoping for a response. Nothing but static. The elevator remained still, locking us in place. My hands felt clammy, my pulse uneven. The air was too thick, too charged with something I didn't want to name. Ryan sighed, shifting slightly. I used to think you didn't like me. My head snapped toward him. That's not true. He let out a low chuckle. Maybe not, but you act like being around me makes you uncomfortable. Uncomfortable, the word was too simple for what I felt. I forced a small, tight smile. You're imagining things. Ryan didn't reply right away. He just studied me. His gaze lingering. The space between us wasn't much, 3 feet at most, but it felt like nothing. I see the way you look at me, he murmured. My breath caught at a flicker of something dangerous passed between us. Something neither of us should have acknowledged. I shook my head. Ryan, this isn't. The lights flickered again. The elevator shuddered, but still didn't move. The small jolt made me stumble slightly, and in an instant his hands were on me, steadying me. His grip was firm, warm, stronger than I expected. I should have pulled away immediately, but I didn't. His hands lingered, fingers pressed lightly against my arms, sending heat through my skin. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else. Too close, too warm. I finally stepped back, my breath unsteady. We should focus on getting out of here. Ryan's gaze stayed on me for a moment longer before he nodded, sliding his hands into his pockets. Yeah, he said, probably, but something had shifted. If you're enjoying the story, consider subscribing to my channel and leaving a comment about what you like or dislike. Thank you for your support. The silence between us wasn't empty anymore. It was thick with unspoken words, unacknowledged feelings, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't ignore the way his touch still lingered on my skin. I pressed my palms against the cool metal of the elevator wall, trying to steady my breath. The space felt smaller now, as if the walls were inching closer, leaving no room for escape. The air was thick with something I refused to name, something that had been lurking beneath the surface for longer than I cared to admit. Ryan leaned against the opposite wall, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. There was no smugness, no teasing smirk, just quiet, patient curiosity, as if he were waiting for me to acknowledge what we both knew was there. I focused on the emergency panel again, pressing the call button one more time. But the only response was the same static-filled silence. Frustration bubbled inside me, mixing with the ooze that had settled deep in my stomach. This is ridiculous, I muttered under my breath, rubbing my temples. Ryan's voice was calm when he spoke. You're not claustrophobic, are you? No, I answered too quickly, and his lips twitched as if he caught my lie. I wasn't afraid of small spaces. I was afraid of this space, of the way it forced me to acknowledge things I had spent months trying to ignore. He shifted, pushing off the wall, moving a step closer. We might be in here a while. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening as he closed the distance between us. He wasn't doing anything inappropriate. He wasn't touching me, wasn't even crowding me, but his presence was overpowering, stealing the air between us. I had always known Ryan was attractive, but in the past it had been an abstract thought, something I dismissed as an objective fact rather than a personal observation, but standing here, now in the dim glow of the emergency light, I saw him differently, the sharp cut of his jaw, the confident way he carried himself, the intensity in his eyes that held me in place. He wasn't a boy anymore. He hadn't been for a long time. I forced myself to breathe, to pull my thoughts back from dangerous territory. We just need to stay calm and wait for help, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Ryan studied me for a moment, then nodded. All right. He sat down on the floor, stretching out his legs, like he had all the time in the world. I hesitated, then did the same, keeping a safe distance between us. Minutes passed in silence, but it wasn't a comfortable one. Every breath felt too loud, every small movement too noticeable. I was hyper-aware of him, of the slow rise and fall of his chest, the way his fingers tapped absently against his knee, the occasional glance he stole in my direction. Then he spoke, his voice quieter. Now, do you ever get lonely? The question caught me off guard. I turned to look at him, expecting some kind of joke in his expression, but there was none. He was serious. I hesitated, then let out a small, humorless laugh. That's a strange thing to ask. He shrugged. Not really. I just wonder sometimes. You always seem distant. I opened my mouth to deny it, to tell him he was imagining things, but the words wouldn't come because he wasn't wrong. Loneliness had become such a constant in my life that I barely noticed it anymore. It was there in the quiet of the house, when Richard was away, in the long hours at work that I used as a distraction, in the empty bases of my marriage, where love had once lived instead of answering. I looked away, focusing on the dim glow of the elevator light, but Ryan didn't press. He just watched me as if he already understood the truth. I wasn't ready to admit. Somewhere far above us, the building creaked, metal groaning as the weight of the elevator pressed against its cables. The sound sent a small shiver down my spine, but I forced myself to stay still. Ryan's voice was softer now, more careful. I used to think you were cold. I turned to him, startled by the honesty in his tone. He gave a small, almost apologetic smile. When I was younger, I thought you didn't care about me. You were always so put together, so controlled. I didn't think you ever felt anything. A lump formed in my throat, unexpected and heavy. That's not true. He nodded slowly. I know that now. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us had changed again, shifting from uncomfortable to something deeper, something heavier. It wasn't just words being exchanged. It was understanding, a recognition of something we had both ignored for too long. And in that moment, as his eyes held mine, in the dim light, I realized something terrifying. I wasn't sure I wanted to ignore it anymore. The elevator was silent, except for the faint hum of electricity and the occasional groan of metal shifting overhead. I tried to focus on my breathing, on the steady rise and fall of my chest, but it was impossible because I wasn't alone, because Ryan was sitting too close, watching me with an expression that was too knowing, too aware, because no matter how much I tried to ignore it, I could feel the weight of his presence pressing into the air between us, thick and inescapable. I shifted slightly, folding my arms over my chest as if that could shield me from whatever was happening in this confined space. But when I moved, my gaze flickered downward just for a second, just long enough to see the unmistakable tension in his body, the way his muscles had gone rigid beneath his clothes. Heat flushed up my neck as I realized what it was. A deep, unsettling awareness settled into my bones, making it impossible to look away. His thighs were tense, his hands resting their fingers curled slightly, as if fighting to remain still, and there, beneath the fabric of his jeans, something undeniable strained against the tight space my breath caught. I looked away sharply, my heart slamming against my ribs. No, this wasn't happening. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing the moment to pass, willing my body to stop reacting to something I had no business noticing, but the damage was already done. The image had seared itself into my mind, impossible to erase. Ryan shifted slightly, clearing his throat. His voice was lower when he spoke. "You're thinking too much." I swallowed hard, keeping my eyes fixed on the elevator doors. "I don't know what you mean." He let out a quiet, almost amused breath. "Yes, you do." The air between us was suffocating. I needed space. I needed this elevator to move, to break whatever spell had settled over us before it was too late. But it didn't move. The world outside didn't exist. There was only this, only him, only the quiet tension wrapping around us like a slow burning fuse. The silence between us stretched thick and heavy. I kept my eyes on the elevator doors, willing them to open, but they remained closed, trapping us in this moment, trapping me with thoughts I shouldn't be having. Ryan shifted beside me, exhaling a slow breath. The air felt warmer now, the space impossibly small. His presence was overpowering, pressing into me in ways I wasn't sure I could ignore much longer. Then, without warning, he reached for the hem of his hoodie, pulling it over his head in one smooth motion before tossing it aside. The movement was casual, but it sent a ripple of awareness through me. "It's too damn hot in here," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. I swallowed hard, forcing my gaze to remain neutral. He wasn't wrong. The air inside the stalled elevator was growing thick and stifling, our combined body heat only making it worse still. The sudden removal of clothing made something tighten in my chest. Then, to my horror, he moved again. He unbuttoned his jeans. I stiffened, my breath caught in my throat as he lifted his hips, slightly sliding the denim down his legs before kicking them off completely. Now he was sitting there in nothing but his t-shirt and dark boxer briefs, looking completely at ease. A sharp heat spread through my body, an involuntary response I had no control over. I forced myself to look anywhere but at him, my pulse hammering in my ears. "What are you doing?" My voice was steady, but barely. Ryan leaned back against the elevator wall, stretching his legs out like he had no concern in the world. "Relax, it's just hot as hell in here, not like I'm naked." I exhaled slowly, pressing my fingers against my temples. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be. I had spent years maintaining careful distance, building walls, keeping everything in its rightful place. But this situation, this small stifling space, the flickering emergency light, the low hum of the elevator around us, was breaking all of it apart. The air between us felt electric, charged with something neither of us wanted to name. My body was rigid, every muscle wound tight, but I could still feel the heat of him beside me, the quiet intensity of his presence pressing into my skin. Ryan hadn't moved, but he didn't have to. The space between us was already too small, too suffocating. His words still lingered in the air, unshaken, undeniable. "You feel it too, don't you?" I swallowed, my throat dry. "Ryan, this isn't..." He shifted, then just slightly turning toward me. "Isn't what?" His voice was low, quiet, but there was something else beneath. It's something raw, something waiting. I kept my gaze forward, refusing to look at him, refusing to acknowledge what was happening. But then he moved again, just enough that I could feel the warmth of his skin near mine. "Tell me you don't feel it," he murmured. I opened my mouth, ready to lie, ready to put the distance back between us, but then he reached out his fingers, brushing lightly over my wrist, barely touching but still burning. I inhaled sharply, the sound too loud in the confined space. It was a mistake, because when I finally turned to him, when our eyes met, I knew I was already lost. The elevator was too dark, the silence too thick, and the weight of everything we had never said crashed down on me all at once. And then it happened. I didn't know who moved first. Maybe it was him, maybe it was me. Maybe it didn't matter. One moment there was hesitation, the next none at all. His lips were on mine, soft at first, tentative, as if waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't, I couldn't. The warmth of his mouth sent a jolt through me, scattering every rational thought, every reason why this shouldn't be happening. He tasted like heat in something unfamiliar, something that made my breath catch and my body tense in ways I didn't understand. For one impossible moment, I let myself sink into it, let myself forget everything outside this space, my name, my marriage, the rules I had so carefully followed all my life. But then reality crashed back, sharp and unforgiving. I pulled away, suddenly breathless, my fingers trembling as they touched my lips. Ryan didn't move, his breathing uneven, his eyes dark with something unreadable. "We can't," I whispered, but my voice held no conviction. Ryan studied me for a long moment, then slowly he leaned back against the wall, exhaling through his nose. "Tell me you didn't want that," he said quietly. The silence between us was deafening. I could still feel the ghost of his lips on mine, the lingering heat that refused to fade. My breath was uneven, my pulse pounding in my ears, and no matter how much I tried to steady myself, I couldn't. Ryan hadn't moved. He just watched me, his gaze dark, searching, waiting. He didn't push, he didn't say a word, but the air between us was thick with everything unspoken, everything we had both been too afraid to acknowledge until now. I should have stood up. I should have pressed the emergency button again, pounded on the doors, done something, anything, to break whatever spell had fallen over us. But I didn't. Instead, I looked at him, really looked at him. His face was cast in shadows from the dim emergency light, but I could still see the sharp angles of his jaw, the steady rise and fall of his chest, the way his fingers flexed against his thighs like he was holding himself back. There was a weight in his eyes, a silent question lingering there. He was waiting for me to decide, and for the first time in a long time, I let myself stop thinking. Slowly I sat up straighter, my hands resting against my lap. My dress clung to my skin, damp from the warmth of the enclosed space. The fabric felt too tight, too constricting, as if it were another barrier between me and the truth I had been running from. Ryan's gaze flickered downward, his throat bobbing as he swallowed. I reached for the thin strap on my shoulder, my fingers trembling slightly as I pulled it down. A sharp inhale broke the silence. I should have felt ashamed. I should have felt afraid, but I didn't, because as Ryan shifted closer, as his fingers reached out to trace the fabric slipping from my skin, I knew there was no turning back. The line had already been crossed, and for the first time in my life, I didn't care.